Good evening, welcome to Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris. So the third payment of the Bantuan Sara Hidup has been disbursed and 3.6 million Malaysians will be the recipients of some 1.23 billion ringgit under the third phase of disbursement. Now, taking a closer look at the effectiveness of cash transfer programs, joining us on the show tonight we have Calvin Cheng, the researcher on economics, trade and regional integration at the think tank ISIS Malaysia. Also, Dr Kenneth Simler, senior economist at the World Bank Global Knowledge and Research Hub. Welcome, gentlemen, to the show. So I want to talk a bit about Cost of Living Allowance, COLA, also known as Bantuan Sara Hidup or BSH, the National Cash Transfer Program, formerly known as BRIM, Bantuan Rakyat Satu Malaysia. We love our acronyms here, don't we?
Yes.
So let's, I guess, begin by tracing the evolution of BRIM or Bantuan Sara Hidup as we know it now. So BRIM conceptualized in 2011 under then Prime Minister Datuk Seri Najib Razak. Disbursed in 2012, right?
Yep.
So maybe you guys can help us trace the kind of evolution of the cash transfer program. Who wants to take this? Ken?
You want to start off?
All right, Calvin, you can set it up for us.
Well, as you mentioned, the first benefits were paid out in 2012. And then every year after that, it's just been, I think, just an increase in benefits every year. And then last year, it was changed to Bantuan Sara Hidup from BRIM. And I think that was probably one of the most drastic changes we've seen since the inception of BRIM, in that some of the categories were changed. And I think one of the more important things is that we had the addition of household size adjustment for the benefits, right? So
it's more than just cosmetic, more than just a name change.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So would you say it's a revamp of the entire program? Because now we're not just looking at giving cash handouts, it's a look at different eligibility criteria, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Right. No, I would say a course change, a course shift.
Absolutely.
Because the eligibility requirements were fairly similar to BRIM as far as the income thresholds and the other requirements for eligibility. And as Calvin mentioned, the big change was previously the amount of the benefit paid was the same for all households within a given income bracket. The BSH, when it was introduced last year in the budget speech, brought in this additional 120 ringgit per year for each child in the household under the age of 18, up to 4 children and beyond that. So it for the first time tied the level of the benefits to the composition of the household.
Right.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, so and you mentioned, Calvin, that there's been a steady increase in the total amount of Bantuan Sara Hidup or cash transfers that has been given out every year?
Yeah.
So does that mean more people or the money has just increased?
I think the money has increased. And I think if you look at since the beginning, there's definitely more people on it as well.
Okay.
I mean, if you compare 2018 to 2012, there's certainly an increase. But I think if you look at this year's new BSH, there's been a decrease of about 2 million recipients, and I think that was done mainly by the removal of the single, what they call BRIM Bujang, so the single BRIM for singles.
Okay.
So that was another huge change in BSH. So I think that shaved off about 2 million recipients.
All right.
Yeah.
So the composition has changed, but the size has continued to grow in terms of money and recipients. Would that be accurate to say?
Well,
no?
it has increased up to 2018 in terms
and then
in
there
terms
was
of the
that
number of
decrease.
recipients, and
I
then
see.
there's been a decrease in recipients since then. Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
Right. And the amount of the benefits per household receiving it has increased over time, fairly incrementally.
Yeah, very marginally.
It's not.
Yeah.
It's been
I don't want to be misleading and say that it's very large. It has increased, but it's been very marginal.
And how would you, I guess, compare the differences in the effectiveness of what was then BRIM and what is now Bantuan Sara Hidup, given these different iterations?
Okay. The first qualifier is, while we have income data from the household income survey collected by the Department of Statistics Malaysia, for BRIM, we don't have it for Bantuan Sara Hidup because it was just introduced this year. That have not been collected at the household survey level yet.
Okay.
From looking at the design of the program, it appears to me that it should be somewhat more effective, and that mostly by taking into account size of households.
Okay. When you say effective, what is the I guess the goal at the end of the day, Ken?
The end of the day is to reduce poverty, is to address the needs of people who are living the lower end of the income distribution, whether it's the B40, the B20, the B10, and increasing their resources to carry on their life. So, reducing monetary poverty, also reducing inequality, because it's a cash transfer.
And is cash transfer effective in reducing inequality? Because there are people who disagree fundamentally disagree with the ideology of cash transfer programs. They say it encourages a dependency mindset. It discourages work. What has research told us about that, Calvin?
Right. So I think that's a very common trope that people like to throw about when they talk about cash transfers, typically accompanied by assertions that poor people are lazy and the sort. But I think the international evidence over the past 2 decades of hundreds of studies over many different programs around the world has shown that typically work disincentives resulting from cash transfers are very, very low. Typically, cash transfer recipients do not decrease work intensity, they do not decrease work hours, and some studies even show that some recipients increase work intensity, increase work hours. And there's been very little evidence that it sort of creates any sort of dependency. As we've seen, recipients increase their savings, they increase their investment, increase their production. Certainly on those things, the evidence is more mixed, but there's simply no evidence to show that there's any dependency or laziness arising from cash transfer programs.
Okay. I would agree. I mean, within any program, you will find outliers, you'll find exceptions, somebody who takes a good thing and ruins it. You'll also find some bad programs. There are programs that might be designed such that the benefit schedule provides a disincentive to work. Okay, but this is not, we have enough experience with this, there's enough world kind of evidence on this to work on that. And I would say there's, across the world, there's a lot of evidence that this cash transfers really can provide a very safe, very good safety net, very good safety net.
I guess,
for these
a social protection program.
And if I could put in a plug for a former colleague, there's something called the Transfer Project, and I think it's transferproject.org, but where they've studied systematically and rigorously transfer programs across the globe, and most of them are highly successful.
I guess the reason I ask this is because there's been a lot of, especially in the past government, there was a lot of talk about the dependency on subsidies, right? That subsidy mindset, that you have to wean yourself off this sugar dependency, the sugar rush that you get when you have subsidies. So how does that jive, with the fact that research has shown that cash transfers are effective?
I think some of it is just the language used. I mean, for BR1M or for Bantuan Sara Hidup, you hear about cash handouts.
All
right.
And typically I try to push back on that term. I don't like using that.
You don't like
cash
the term
handouts.
cash handouts?
All right.
So you like cash transfers?
Cash transfers, cash
Does anyone who
assistance.
put RON 95 in their tank think they got a cash handout because of the fuel subsidy? They don't think about it that way, do they? All right. I don't know what the budgets are for what the budget is for the fuel subsidy, but it definitely reaches more people. And it's not targeted at all. Other than basically, it's actually regressive in that that kind of subsidy in kind, it benefits the people who drive the biggest and the most cars.
Okay, so we should be thinking of it not as cash handouts, but rather cash transfers. I guess because there used to be the idea that cash handouts are politically motivated.
Oh, absolutely,
and has that kind of agenda. But coming back to cash transfers, between conditional cash transfers and unconditional cash transfers, Bantuan Sara Hidup is unconditional. There are no strings attached. You get the cash, you go and spend it as you see fit for your household. Do you think that perhaps Malaysia should be looking at conditional cash transfers, vouchers, for instance, other types of transfers? Would that be more effective in your opinion?
Well, I come partly from the standpoint that looking at cash puts the decision in the hands of the recipient, all right? So it empowers them to make their decisions, good or bad. That's one thing. And when you talk about conditional cash transfers in Malaysia, my next question would be then, what kind of behavior you're trying to encourage? In poorer countries, often it's encourage school attendance. School attendance is already very high in Malaysia. It could be going to clinics. That's also already very high. So what, rather than just coming up with a generic conditional cash transfer, think what condition you're trying to meet.
Right.
There could be some things out there. I haven't heard a convincing story yet, but I'm open.
Okay, all right. So it has to be targeted to a certain behavior that you want to encourage.
Absolutely.
Did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I want to add something in that making the program conditional, it's not an easy choice, right? It's not a free ride. You know, you think like, oh, schooling or health outcomes, that sounds like a great idea. It's like so simple, why wouldn't you do it? The reason why we don't do it, or why you may not want to do it, is because there are huge costs associated with imposing conditionality on recipients.
What kind of cost?
So the first cost is literal, right? So it makes it more expensive because policymakers have to enforce these conditions. They have to check periodically, are you attending school?
Right.
Are you meeting this requirement, meeting that requirement? And that's huge complexity, huge bureaucratic costs, and huge increases in monetary costs, right? And the second trade-off I would want to highlight is that imposing conditions can sort of put the burden on the poorest households the most. So it's often the poorest who can't meet these conditions, and if they can't meet these conditions in a strictly conditional cash transfer program, they get cut off, so they don't get assistance.
They fall
so
through
they
the
fall
cracks,
through
right?
the cracks,
Okay.
absolutely. So I think that those costs are very large and sort of argue against why we shouldn't impose a conditional cash transfer program in BRIM at this BSH at this time.
Okay, all right. We're going to continue this conversation on Bantuan Sara Hidup after this, specifically looking at who should be receiving it. Stay tuned to consider this.